In the weeks before the Sky Tour, there were small warnings that felt like coincidences. Ultra-low-frequency seismographs in Iceland hummed with a rhythm no tectonic plate had reason to play. In the Atacama, the ALMA interferometers recorded a neat, stair-step dropout in the background hiss of the universe, as if someone had pressed mute in precisely tuned intervals. Migratory birds in Finland banked mid-flight to form a slow spiral that held its shape against the wind. None of it was alarming enough on its own. Together, it was a whisper behind a door. "You are not alone." Dr. Sunarihime, who had moved to the desert to measure quiet things, noticed the pattern first in the noise. She lived in a prefabricated module 50 meters from Raypad 14, a metal box that rattled when the night winds came in from the high plateau. That morning she padded across the concrete in thick socks, mug clutched in both hands, and found that the sky black, crisp, ordinary had a bruise at the horizon, a smudge of deeper night. She frowned at it. Stars should not smudge. By the time she reached the control console, the bruise had become a seam. The monitors painted it in false color, heat signatures at absolute zero, a fault line in the math. She called it in. Her supervisor didn't pick up. Nobody's phone did. She leaned closer to the glass, and her coffee cooled untouched. Far away, in Bucharest, a trilingual kindergarten class rehearsed their morning poem, Bună dimineața, Lume. They sang, "Good morning, world." Little palms smacked on little desks, a tiny percussion section. The teacher, Mara Ionescu, had her back to the windows while she drew a sun with a smiling face on the board. The children giggled. The windows went dark, as though a cloud the size of a continent had slipped between city and day. In Lagos, vendors paused at the sound of generators stuttering in unison, like a stadium crowd holding its breath. In a small fishing town in Hokkaido, an old man untangled his nets and carefully stood, listening to his joints pop, because the sea, always chatty with its small gossip of wavelets, had grown serious and glassy. A Russian flight over the Barents Sea sent a terse message to tower. "Starlight is bending." A swarm of hobby drones in Nevada rose, panicked by signals they were not designed to understand, turning the desert into a brief silver snow. When the seam finally opened, it did not rip. Space folded, tiddly, as if some enormous, patient hand had creased it along a ruler's edge. The sky did not scream. It made a sound that was more absence than noise. A subtraction, the hush when a cathedral door swings closed, sealing out the traffic and rain. Sana watched a shape emerge from that crease, and then another. They were not smooth, not the polished bullets that films had taught her to expect. They were wrong to look at, their lines refusing to settle. Facets that seemed to move at the corner of the eye like something half-decided. They were too big to be atmospheric. They filled the screens, and then they filled the sky. In Nairobi, a construction crane operator named Kamo locked his joystick and sat back, the cabin's fan tickling his sweaty neck. One of the ships slid across the sun, not eclipsing it, but refracting it into a halo like a saint's portrait. He felt suddenly that he was very small and very important on an American destroyer in the Pacific. A sailor named Ruiz spat into the wind and said a prayer she hadn't said since she was 12. "Dios, por favor," she muttered, and then felt foolish, and then said it again, because saying a prayer is also a way to mark the moment when the world stops and becomes something else. The first message arrived before anyone named what the ships were. It arrived on radios and televisions, wormed into fiber, unzipped airwave and cable. Subtitles unfurled in 96 scripts. Text crawled across smart fridges, parking meters, ski lift signage, children's toy tablets. It slid through cochlear implants and, for those without ears, lit in the patterns of retinal prosthetics. It found the blind in braille vibrations on their palms. The words were the same everywhere. People learned later that the cadence had matched lullabies, prayers, the rhythms of letters taught to toddlers. It felt familiar, as propaganda should. Submit. Join the order of dominion. Resistance is a logical. It was spoken, too. Not a sound in air but a pressure in bone. It registered behind the eyes, at the soft fontanelle that had closed decades ago, and left behind a vanilla-sweet ghost of taste that made some gag and others weep. For a handful of people, it arrived in smell, an ancestral smokehouse memory, cedar and fat. For one woman in Mumbai whose inner ear had been destroyed by childhood fever, it came as a pattern of cool across her cheeks, Morse-coded by the tiny hairs on her skin. She said later that it felt like someone was brushing her face with the leaves of a plant that didn't grow on Earth. Translated into the languages of the net, the phrase bloomed. Memes hatched and went dead in the same breath. Official accounts posted, then deleted, then posted again. The feeds were a waterfall in reverse, water clinging to the cliff, unwilling to fall. In Geneva, a dozen diplomatic channels blinked urgent. They used words like first contact, unprecedented, Security Council, stand by. In Beijing, a general with a scholar's hands folded them carefully and wondered how many centuries of history could pivot in a morning. In Brasilia, a traffic helicopter hovered low over the stalled highway while the pilot pointed his camera at the sky and, without thinking, crossed himself on live television. In a Kansas farmhouse, a woman who had never gone farther than the next county carved the message into a piece of scrap pine with her pocket knife because the act of making the letters steadied her fingers. Above the Amazon basin, one of the ships slowed, its vastness rescued from abstraction by cloud shadows. By the way the forest's breathing mist hooked to its edges. Over the Atlantic, another swung wide and parked where geostationary satellites kept polite distance, crowding the lane like an 18-wheeler in a bike path. The largest stopped directly over the African Great Rift, a blade of shade across 3 nations. The cool it cast lifting the hair on a million forearms. For a while, humanity sat where it was. People held bottles poised at lips. A surgeon held a clamp in a belly and did not move it. A thief held a wallet and slowly put it back. A firefighter held the rungs and took one last step up, because even at the end of the world, smoke kills the same as always. Someone on a couch somewhere laughed, a cracked sound. The human engine coughing before it turned over. The second message came with a patience that felt like condescension. Submit. Join the Order of Dominion. Resistance is illogical. Construction of alignment spires will begin in 12 days. Provide labor. Provide minds. Provide peace. The words provide peace were the ones that landed like a stone in a pond. Some misheard it as a promise. Others understood immediately that peace was not the same as freedom. Still others clung to the idea that if they simply bent, lightly, temporarily, the storm would pass over them. Newsrooms did what newsrooms do. A host with perfect hair asked a scientist with imperfect hair to explain the physics of a sky that folded like linen. The scientist opened her mouth and found that theory, which normally poured out of her like a river, had become a dry creek bed. Topological manipulation, she said finally. Spacetime origami. The host made a face of comprehension for the audience, and then they cut to video of a ship over Cairo, the Nile a silver thread at its feet. Conspiracy channels erupted into fever. Some celebrated vindication. Some insisted it was a hoax, new tech from an old empire, a psyop. Street preachers shouted into the wind with their eyes closed against the shade. Professors drafted statements they would later regret. Teenagers recorded reaction videos that they would unlist and then relist. Embarrassed by their own shock, in the chat roll of 1,000 live streams, someone typed over and over, "This is actually happening." It became a kind of mantra, a small spell to keep the world from tipping underfoot. Sana called her sister, who did not pick up. Then she called her father. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice smaller when he was afraid, like a figure seen down a long hallway. "Seni Ajun, I'm here," she said. "I'm okay. Where are you?" "At work. You should come home," he said, as if crossing to continents for tea were something one did between errands. "It is not safe. It's safe as anywhere," she said. On her screen a ship rolled its shoulder, and the desert got a sudden dusk. "Baba, they're everywhere." He was quiet. She could hear the sound of his breath through his nose, a sound from childhood when he fell asleep in his chair holding a book over his heart. "When your grandfather left Shiraz," he said, "there was a curfew. At sunset, soldiers with sticks, the whole world upside down. He said to your mother, 'Do not let the children learn the shape of fear.' I don't know how he thought we could do that, but we tried. Come home." She imagined him at the window, daylight on his cheek, the plant he overwatered drooping on the sill. One ship moved sideways across the Chilean sky like a wall that had decided to stroll. She wanted to tell him about the smell the message had left in her mouth, the clean sweet of something that had never grown in soil. Instead she said, "I'll try when I can." And then, because it felt necessary to do a human thing, she asked, "What are you making for lunch?" "Eggs," he said, with relief, and launched into a description of an omelet that involved more butter than biology would recommend. He was still describing the way the edges should foam when the feed lagged, caught up, and he turned back into a voice from the far end of a tunnel. "And don't forget he vanished." The call failed. She stood there, phone to ear, listening to the dessert ring. Across continents, governments did the choreography they had rehearsed in simulations with names like Blacksky and Visitor. Militaries scrambled jets, then grounded them when pilots reported that the air around the ships was not the same air they had trained in. War rooms lit their big screens, discovered those screens were too small. Mayors pressed the buttons that sent clean water to more places and encouraged people, kindly, to stay home if they could. Clerks found the old keys to old basements where old civil defense kits had been stored. Boxes of crackers that had outlived their intended century. Somebody in an underground facility flipped a switch labeled Broadcast Override. And the switch did nothing because the message was not riding the rails they knew how to interrupt. In a Warsaw hospital, a nurse named Lydia wheeled a morphine pump down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and soap. A man with a ruined lung snored under his oxygen mask. Out the window, a ship tilted like the keel of a boat. Lydia took out her phone and filmed it for her son, then deleted the video because it felt like a desecration to put so large a thing into such a small screen dot in a prison yard in Arizona. A woman named Jackie looked up and felt something crackle across her scalp. The tiny lightning of the message using the metal plate in her skull like an antenna. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only place for that feeling to go. "We got company," she told the guard in the tower. He did not look up. He kept his hands on the rifle like a man who does not know how to hold his own hands. In a boardroom high above Jakarta's harbor, an executive with a beautiful watch began the sentence, "We need to consider our," and then could not finish it. He took off his watch and set it on the table, palm down, as if it might otherwise fly away. The third message came quietly. It was not a command. It was a catalog. Points of the sky lit in a constellation that had no myth on earth. A map unrolled without edges. Names folded out of the dark in a litany. Harrow, Vrisha, Kesh 9, the Rim of Sighs, Stone Mother, the twin rivers of soot. Places that existed, perhaps, under suns someone had named in languages that never grew in a human mouth. The order had come from across those places, carrying their history like an inventory, proof of their size and reach. It did not say, "We are infinite." It implied it. People cried, or laughed, or got hungry suddenly. They took naps at bad times. They texted past lovers, the dear ones who still lived in their thumbs. They drove to their mothers' houses. They stayed exactly where they were, because where are you going to go when the ceiling falls? In a damp apartment in Marseille, a boy of 8 kneeled on his mattress and pressed his palms together, as he had seen his grandmother do when her hip hurt. He did not know any prayers. He said to someone, "Please," and didn't say what for. In a skyscraper in Seoul, 2 elevators passed each other like ships, and their passengers raised their eyebrows, recognizing in the mirror of strangers the look they themselves were wearing. A chess park in Yerevan fell quiet as a rook hovered over a square for a full minute, before committing itself because strategy suddenly felt beside the point, and exactly the point. A poet in Lagos wrote a line that she would later delete because it was too obvious, and then another line that made her mouth open slightly when she read it back. By afternoon in Europe, morning in America, night in Asia, the ships had stopped moving. They were in their chosen places, and the earth had arranged itself around them in the disorderly order of a species, very bad at unanimity and very good at improvisation. In the brief lull, there were the first acts of unnecessary kindness, a bottle of water pressed into someone else's, hand at a bus stop, a baker in Marrakesh giving away the day's bread, a teenager holding a stranger's dog while the stranger went inside to vomit and cry. At an emergency session in Geneva, in the crumbling old assembly hall whose chandeliers had seen nastier storms, the microphones were live. A translator's booth hummed. The chairs squeaked their displeasure at being asked to do history again. The alien emissaries had not yet arrived. They had sent their messages and then waited. A teacher who had given an assignment to a noisy class. Delegates looked at one another and not at the ceiling. Someone said we must. Someone else said if we. Someone else said our first. It was new. What lay ahead? It was also old. Something humanity had done in caves and palaces and on battlefields and in bedrooms. Look at a thing too big to fit into the head and try to make a decision anyway. Sanaa watched the feed on her console. The room in Geneva looked like every room in which people had ever tried to be wise. She imagined the smell of wood polish and coffee. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister came through all at once. A stack of messages that had been bouncing off some invisible membrane and now tumbled into her hand. Are you seeing this? Where are you? Come home. I made ashiri shte, your favorite. I'm scared. Call me. She typed back. I'm okay. Eat. Save me a bowl. I love you. The sending wheel spun and spun. The message did not go. The fourth message came when people had started to believe there might not be another. It was 2 words shorter than the first, 5 words longer than the second. The same tone as a debt collector. Submit. Join the order of dominion. Resistance is illogical. Spires will synchronize all thought. Harmony will end suffering. Begin compliance. It ran like weather into the world's low places, pooling in the pockets of those who wanted to be told what to do and be left alone once they did it. It skated across the minds of those whose skulls were thick with skepticism and left a scratch. They would count with their tongues for weeks. It filled the mouths of children who repeated the phrases without understanding, because that is what children do when something new arrives. Taste it, try it on, make it theirs. The words became a thing you could point at. They became a future offered like a contract with no small print. In a small apartment in Timakora, Mara Ionescu finally turned from her classroom's dark windows. The children had gone home hours ago, lifted and carried and tugged by parents whose eyes kept darting upward, even though there was nothing to see through the roof. She sat alone at her desk and replied to an email she had been avoiding, because it suddenly seemed noble to conclude one tiny piece of unfinished business. When she hit send, the network, contrite, allowed it. The little whoosh of a departing message made her smile, briefly and with surprise. On a California freeway, Ruiz the sailor crawled toward an off-ramp while everyone around her obeyed traffic laws like monks, signaling, leaving space, letting each other in. This, she thought, this is what we could have been doing all along. She wished she were already at sea, but the sea was so near now, coming to her in the shape of a ship that blotted a patch of sky. She rolled down her window. The air smelled of hot brakes and dry grass and the faint, bitter bite of something new. The silence after the fourth message was itself a message. People looked at their leaders. Leaders looked at one another. The ships did not move. The sun moved, and with it the shadows of the ships oared slowly across towns and fields, across apartment blocks and cathedrals and empty stadiums where schedules printed months ago had filled the afternoons with a different hope. In the old assembly hall, a chair scraped. A microphone squealed. The room inhaled. The emissaries had not yet set foot on any soil. They had done it all from the air, from the not air, from whatever medium carried their certainty to every ear and bone. The first human words spoken into a microphone at the emergency session were a greeting and a stalling tactic. The second were a question dressed as a greeting. The third were a blessing disguised as a question. The world listened. Wind moved across wheat. A dog barked at an empty corner until soothed with a hand. A baby, born an hour ago, cried for the first time and then stopped, startled by her own voice. In the high desert, Sanaa took her mug, now cold, and poured it in a neat brown arc onto sunburned gravel. She put the mug upside down on the rail to keep dust out, habit against chaos. What happens next, she thought, has always been happening. We make a shape with our mouths. We say it together or we say it alone. Either way, the shape makes us. And in that held breathin', that hum of servers and heartbeats and stadium lights cooling, In the shade of ships that bent the day, humanity waited for someone, anyone, to answer. The silence stretched until it felt like an edge you could cut yourself on. The sky, for its part, remained as it had become, creased. The ships remained what they were, impossible. The message hung like an instruction manual dropped on a table, a set of steps anyone could follow if they chose. We are told that some gods demand songs, some demand offerings. These demanded compliance, a quieter thing, and because it was quieter, it was somehow more terrible. In 1,000 rooms, in 1,000,000 hearts, something rose to meet it that did not yet have a word. It would, soon enough. For the moment, it hovered, unshaped, a refusal, still taking breath. The world held still. The day took another small step forward, and the silence went on. The emissaries came quietly, as though they already owned the ground beneath their feet. At first, humanity expected thunder, explosions, or the fire of weapons never seen before. But the landings were delicate ships that folded like petals, their surfaces shifting in fractal tessellations that seemed to whisper, "We have done this countless times before. This is routine." The first landed in the Sonoran Desert, not far from the border where old scars of fences and walls lay rusting in the sand. Another set down in the ruins of Aleppo, amid dust still clinging to half-collapsed buildings. A third chose the Serengeti, its bulk resting with indifference among the wildbeast who scattered in dark, rippling tides. Wherever they appeared, the message followed: "We are the order of dominion. We do not conquer, we align. Your divisions end now. Your resistance is illogical." They did not ask permission. They did not offer names. The shape of them no to emissaries were alike. Yet all carried the same wrongness, the same refusal to fit neatly into the rules of human perception. Some looked like towers of glass refracting colors no spectrum chart accounted for. Others stood on too many legs that folded inward like origami at rest. One, filmed in Nairobi, appeared as a lattice of floating spheres, each one rotating as if calculating equations in silence. They radiated not menace, but inevitability. A child watching from her mother's arms in Mexico City whispered, "They look like homework." The clip went viral in hours, captioned again and again. Homework from the stars, the spires when they spoke again. It was not with voices or bone-vibrating pulses, but with shimmering projections cast into the air above every city. People craned their necks to watch blueprints bloom in the sky, thin lines of light coalescing into towers. Each spire was the same, a central needle, ribbed with spirals, topped with a halo that pulsed like a heartbeat. The order explained. Alignment spires will synchronize all thought. Harmony ends suffering. Begin construction. Provide labor. Provide minds. Provide peace. The designs unrolled further, showing scaffolds, materials, even the dimensions of the foundations. Each projection annotated the blueprints in the local tongue, adjusting units to match local standards, as if to say, "We know how you measure. We know how you build. Now you will build for us." Architects gasped despite themselves. The elegance of the structures was undeniable. Self-sustaining, earthquake-proof, resistant to wind shear, requiring minimal maintenance once completed. It was the sort of design humanity had always chased, but never quite reached. A gift if one ignored the purpose. Engineers whispered that the spires were plausible. Builders argued that the materials could be scavenged from steel mills and prefabs within weeks. The order had not only demanded but demonstrated that their plan could be carried out quickly. And yet, in kitchens, in taverns, in subway cars, humanity murmured another truth. The spires were prisons. Submission and silence signed capitals around the globe. Leaders met in underground chambers, voices strained with both fear and calculation. Some argued pragmatism. "We cannot fight," they said. "Better to bend than to break." Others raged at the humiliation of it, to be commanded like children told to clean their rooms. In the United Nations Hall, translators repeated the alien message in 193 tongues, and still the meaning was unchanged. Submission. On the streets, reaction fractured. In Paris, protesters burned effigies of the spires before police broke them up. In Lagos, graffiti bloomed overnight. "We are not tools." In Jakarta, crowds gathered beneath the alien projections and prayed, mistaking the demand for prophecy. In some villages in the Amazon, People turned off their radios and went on fishing as though nothing had changed, muttering, "Let the sky devils take the cities if they wish. The forest is ours." The weight of inevitability. Emissaries walked among humans without fear. They ignored weapons. They did not flinch at screams or offerings. Their confidence was the heaviest thing about them. They had seen it all before: panic, awe, surrender. A young soldier in Cairo aimed his rifle at one of the emissaries, sweat stinging his eyes. He hesitated, pulled the trigger, and the bullet stopped midair, hovering like an insect in amber. The emissary turned its lattice of spheres toward him. The soldier dropped the rifle and sobbed. No one punished him. No one had to. The order's calm silence was punishment enough. Fear in the ordinary life stumbled onward. Markets opened. Children were sent to school, though their teachers spent more time staring out the window than writing on the board. In New Delhi, a wedding procession danced through the streets beneath a projection of a spire, the bride's jewelry glittering with defiance or denial. In New York, subway performers played their violins harder than ever, as though louder music might drown the hum of inevitability. And everywhere, people felt a new gravity pressing against their chests, not the kind that drags you into the earth, but the kind that drags your mind toward obedience. It was the gravity of inevitability. And yet beneath it, in whispers, in silence, in the steady tightening of jaws, something else began to stir. Not surrender, not yet, something that would soon find its voice. The Assembly Hall in Geneva had seen many arguments. It had held the thunder of speeches that rattled nations and the quiet murmurs of compromises whispered into history. It had survived wars, treaties, betrayals, promises, and failures. But never before had it hosted a silence so heavy it felt alive. Delegates sat stiff in their seats, eyes on the emissaries, who stood unmoving at the center of the chamber. The alien forms flickered half solid, half suggestion, as if reality itself were reluctant to contain them. Their projections translated in real time, a cascade of words flowing across the curved wall of the hall. The message was the same as always, stripped of nuance, stripped of hope: submit. Join the order of dominion. Resistance is illogical. Begin compliance. The room did not breathe. 100 microphones stood ready, but no voice rose. Presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, envoys, they all waited, each hoping another would be the first to respond. No one wanted to be remembered as the leader who doomed humanity by speaking out of turn. The first no, it came from neither a president nor a general. It came from a translator. Her name was Alina Kovacs, a Hungarian woman in her 30s, who had been translating for Central European delegates for nearly a decade. She was known for her calm delivery, her precise intonation, her ability to carry the heat of political rhetoric across language without adding fire of her own. But now, staring at the alien emissaries, her hands trembling above the microphone, she whispered into the headset line, "No." Her voice carried into dozens of ears. At first, the delegates who heard it thought it was a mistake. A word slipped into her throat by fear, but she repeated it, stronger this time. "No." The sound bounced across translation booths, caught by open mix, fed into channels, amplified into feeds. Within seconds, it echoed through the chamber itself. Heads turned toward her, stunned. She stood, face pale but jaw locked, and said it again, "No." It was as though a spell broke. The Ripley, a delegate from Chile, stood, his voice hoarse. "No." A Nigerian minister rose beside him. "No." From the back row, a Japanese ambassador, old and nearly blind, lifted his cane and thumped it once against the floor. "No." The words spread through the hall like fire finding dry grass. Delegates who had trembled in silence shouted it with newfound strength. The translation systems failed under the flood, but it no longer mattered. In every language, the word was short, sharp, universal. No. The emissaries tilted their shifting heads, as if puzzled. They had seen protests before. They had heard pleas. But this was different. This was not negotiation. This was refusal. The broadcastments to the delegates. The session was being broadcast first locally, then virally, as news networks hacked into the feed. Within minutes, billions were watching. On a street in Sao Paulo, a fruit vendor froze, knife in hand, listening to the chant. He dropped the knife and shouted "No." so loud that pigeons scattered from the power lines above in Manila. A grandmother teaching her grandson to read had the television on in the background. She pointed to the screen, eyes fierce, and said, "Sabihin mo no." The boy repeated it, uncertain. Then louder, "No." In Johannesburg, a crowd gathered around a taxi rank radio, and when they heard the word, they began to chant it together. Fists raised. In Beijing, in New Delhi, in Moscow, in New York, on factory floors, in crowded apartments, in farm fields, in prison yards, human beings lifted their voices. No, no, no. It spread faster than the Dominion's message had ever spread. No longer a whisper of defiance, it was a storm. The children in a refugee camp in Lebanon. Children began chanting it in play, stamping their feet to the rhythm. No, no, no. The sound carried through the tents like a drumbeat, until the adults around them joined in. Soon the entire camp thundered, with refusal. In a wealthy school in London, students slipped away from their teachers, gathered in the courtyard, and shouted the word into the open air, their voices echoing off the stone walls. In a remote Alaskan village, where internet lagged by hours, a single radio station replayed the sound of the Geneva Hall. The village gathered around the crackling broadcast, and one by one, they said it aloud, testing the weight of it. No, the world was singing one word in unison. The emissaries' reaction. The alien emissaries did not flinch. They did not retaliate. They simply tilted their heads in eerie synchronization, as if listening to a sound they had never heard before. Their response, when it came, was as calm as the first message. Resistance is illogical. You will comply. But the words no longer struck bone. They no longer carried inevitability, because humanity had found a counterweight, because humanity had spoken in one voice, and the word was louder than fear. The turning point in Geneva, the chant shook the chamber. Diplomats who had spent careers learning caution were shouting until their throats went raw. The sound spilled out of the building, onto the streets, into the airwaves, across satellites, into every corner of the earth. No longer divided by nation, faith, or ideology, humanity was, for a single moment, one species united. Not in love, not in conquest, not in surrender. In defiance. In Lagos, graffiti artists sprayed a single letter across the walls, and in Detroit, factory workers painted the word on steel sheets and held them high. In Cairo, protesters carved it into banners of old bedsheets. In Sydney, crowds gathered on the Opera House steps, their chants carrying out across the harbor. The Dominion had never encountered this before. For millennia, their conquests had ended with swift submission. They had crushed rebellion when it was small, isolated. But never had an entire species refused in unison. For the first time, the Dominion hesitated, and in that hesitation, humanity discovered something terrifying and beautiful, the power of their own voice. The echo of no did not stop at Earth. It traveled upward, carried on hacked transmissions, boosted through satellites, and coded into light signals. It leaked into the dark, across the void, a cry hurled into the stars. On distant worlds under Dominion rule, enslaved species raised their heads. They heard it, they recognized it, and they whispered, for the first time in generations, no. An old satellite dish in rural Argentina, patched together by farmers for soccer games and weather reports, was hijacked by a group of students who had been listening to the Geneva chants. They repurposed it, feeding their voices into the void, bouncing the word no across the dark like a stone across water. It was clumsy, it was weak, but it was first, and it spread. Soon, other signals joined pirate radio, hacked satellites, amateur ham operators. Humanity's refusal became the most contagious frequency in history. Dominion jammers tried to block it, but humanity was not orderly. The chaos of billions of transmitters, each slightly broken, each slightly out of tune, made it impossible to silence. The Dominion had come expecting obedience. Instead, they found noise, defiance layered on defiance, until even their machines faltered. The first battle's Dominion retaliated. Over the Pacific, one of their ships released a beam of cold white light that swept across the sea, boiling the water beneath it. The sound of the ocean screaming carried for miles. They wanted to demonstrate futility. No human weapon could reach them. No wall could block them. And yet, The response was not silence, it was resistance. On the same day, fishermen in Indonesia rammed their wooden boats into the gray legs of a Dominion Spire prototype, as if daring to dent inevitability. In Siberia, engineers hacked together missiles that would never pierce Dominion shields but fired them anyway, forcing the enemy to waste energy swatting gnats. In the streets of Paris, crowds threw stones at holograms of the spires, not because stones could hurt light, but because humans needed to throw something. Everywhere, humans fought not to win, but to refuse. Weapons of the imagination. Dominion could not predict human creativity. Children in Kenya turned toy drones into swarms, buzzing at low altitudes to confuse Dominion sensors. Hackers in Seoul rewrote fragments of Dominion code into songs, which they uploaded across the web. The melodies carried hidden instructions that forced Dominion machines to stutter. In Sao Paulo, poets broadcast their defiance in verse, encoded as data packets that looked meaningless until read aloud. In Detroit, welders stripped abandoned factories to forge improvised railguns that spat steel rods into the sky. They rarely hit their targets, but when they did, it mattered. Humanity's greatest weapon was not strength, it was stubbornness dressed in creativity. Personal vignettes. Lydia, the nurse in Warsaw, once too timid to speak against authority, now ran a hidden clinic in a subway tunnel. When Dominion patrols stormed above, she led patients in whispering no under their breath. The chant a shield against despair. Kamo, the crane operator in Nairobi, became a saboteur, swinging his crane arm into Dominion scaffolds, collapsing weeks of construction in seconds. When they tried to kill him, he laughed because every second he stole from them was victory. Jackie, the prisoner in Arizona, organized inmates into fighters. They broke their chains, stormed the gates, and took over a Dominion supply depot. They painted the word nitrogen monoxide across the desert floor so large it could be seen from the sky. Sana, the scientist in the Atacama, who had first seen the seam in the sky, began coordinating transmissions. She encoded defiance into pulses of light from the observatory's great dishes, aiming not at Earth, but at the stars. She wanted others to hear, and they did. Echoes across the stars. In a planet called Vrisha, a species with translucent wings lifted their heads at the strange Earth broadcast. They had forgotten their own word for resistance centuries ago. Now they whispered the human word, their voices buzzing in unfamiliar shapes. No, on Kesh 9. Miners with blackened lungs heard the signal bleed through Dominion comms. They laid down their tools, not in surrender, but in refusal, across dozens of enslaved worlds. The word spread like a virus the Dominion could not contain. The first rebellion in centuries began not with weapons, but with a single syllable. Humanity's transformation war did not look like the wars of old. Battles were lost, cities burned, spires rose in places humanity could not defend. Yet every time the Dominion struck, humanity rose again, more determined, more united. For once, Earth was not divided by flags. The hacker in Seoul shared code with the poet in Lagos. The fisherman in Indonesia died for the same cause as the nurse in Warsaw. Humanity's history of war, of betrayal, of division, was being rewritten. The Dominion had assumed defiance would crumble. Instead, it hardened. Humanity no longer fought for victory. Humanity fought to stay human. And that made them unbreakable. The emissaries' falterments into the struggle. The emissaries changed. Their confidence wavered. The calm rhythm of their messages grew brittle, almost strained. Submit. Resistance is illogical. Resistance will end. But the words carried no inevitability anymore. They sounded desperate. For the first time in their long history, the Dominion felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not loss. Something far worse. The futurist war would not end quickly. Battles would rage for years. Millions would die. Cities would fall. But every act of defiance, every chant, every sabotage, every whispered no in the dark was victory, because humanity had shown the galaxy something new, that even in the face of inevitability, even against an empire that spanned the stars, a small world could stand tall and say one word. No. And that word echoed across the stars. Louder than any weapon, brighter than any fleet, the Dominion had come to erase humanity. Instead, they had given birth to a rebellion that would outlive them.